I'm very happy to welcome back our favorite guest, Travis Feuerbacher from CF Visas with us today. Travis was a former U.S. diplomat, a U.S. visa officer, and then he's now a visa coach. He's very experienced in terms of F1 visas. Today, we're going to specifically touch on uh, things F1 visa related. I think a lot of you guys come in with questions. So like our teammate Shama mentioned, definitely don't hesitate to send the question into the Q&A and we'll hopefully we can answer as much questions as we could for you guys. Now, I wanted to share my screen to get today's session started. Okay, I think you guys probably are looking at my YouTube stream. Here we go. All right. So welcome in, everybody. Today's session will be focusing on F1 visa trends with the current 2025, especially after Trump's comeback. And today's session will be focusing more on F1 visa stamping, under the current political climates. And then also a lot of people are interested in international travel, even with a current F1 visa. So hopefully Travelers can share some tips and pitfalls to avoid if you wanted to travel with your F1. And then if you wanted to renew your F1 visa for OPT or day one CPT during those periods, we're definitely going to share some tips as well. And then in the second half of today's sessions, we're going to have a Q&A with Travis Feuerbacher, former U.S. visa officer. So if you have any questions after today's sessions, you can feel free to scan the QR code right now. Hopefully we can answer the question for you, or we can kind of recommend you to Travis so that we can have a more in-depth conversation. And just a little bit about who we are as the organizer of the event. We are Go Elite, located in Los Angeles. We're a education consultancy. We are mainly focusing on Day One CPT University's applications and supporting students with their decisions with Day One CPT. And also our mission is to make students' life in America easier. We value international students first, and we're certified by AIRC as one of the most respectful organizations in education. This is one of our current trending events. We currently have a Day One CPT rewards program. If you join the program, you complete, a lot of universities can earn you some points. And another one of these events is the H-1B blessing events. So if you are coming from an Indian or China background, we wanted to bring your prayers to the temples to make you have more luck with the current H-1B luxury lottery. And then also these events are totally free of charge. So definitely scan a code or contact us to learn more about these events. You can also check us out on Google reviews. We have lots of Google reviews of how everybody else rated us. So we're also on all these social media platforms. Definitely feel free to check us out. And without further ado, I will let Travis take the stage.
Thanks, Ryan. And Ryan, you just moved into a new office in Los Angeles, right? Did
Yes,
I see
that's
that?
correct.
Yeah, it looks
Yes,
pretty nice. I'm gonna have to come visit
thank
you
you.
one of these days.
We just moved to Pasadena.
There it is, Pasadena. I like it. Well, thank you so much for having me back. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be presenting with Go Elite. Uh, Before I jump into this, just a quick kind of disclaimer here. I am a lawyer. I'm a U.S. immigration attorney, but the point of this session is not for me to provide legal advice. To do that, I would need to meet with you one-on-one, understand much more about your situation. But if you do have specific legal questions, please don't leave it to chance. Reach out to a qualified immigration lawyer, ask your questions. If you want to reach out to me and my partner Mandy, our email address is here on the screen. So, as Ryan mentioned, my name's Travis. I normally look like this, but unfortunately, I am recovering from a broken shoulder right now. And so I'm wearing a t-shirt. I apologize for that. But I am a U.S. immigration attorney. I used to work for our foreign ministry, the U.S. State Department, and I spent most of my career abroad as a visa officer. So I've interviewed tens of thousands of visa applicants from all over the world. And I will tell you that it was always kind of my favorite time of the day when I got to interview a student. I love talking with students. I love exploring, what's driven them to study in the United States and learning about their goals after they graduate. And so it is a real pleasure to be here with all of you. I've got a lot that I want to go through today, but I really want to focus on the new Trump administration. Specifically, what do we see happening so far since he retook the presidency on January 20th? And what do we expect kind of for the next 4 years and beyond, even? So I'm going to start with a quick history lesson of what we saw in the last Trump administration. I'll give you a quick update on some refusal rates that the State Department published a couple of weeks ago. Then I'll talk about some changes that we have already seen and we expect. And I will end on some tips to hopefully help all of you navigate through the visa process successfully. And then I'll take as many questions as we have time for. So with that, a quick history lesson just to kind of bring us up to speed from the last Trump administration. So from 2017 to 2021, we saw some significant delays kind of creeping into the process. More administrative processing and longer administrative processing delays, longer wait times to schedule visa interviews. But it's arguable that much of these delays kind of were attributable to the COVID pandemic. We shut down lots of visa interviews. It was harder to schedule interviews. It took longer to basically do everything. But so beyond that, we saw some more specific and more alarming trends starting to develop. We saw, so during President Trump's campaign, as he was then candidate Trump, he launched what he commonly referred to as the Muslim ban, which was going to be just a complete ban for all visas for specific, predominantly Muslim countries. That didn't survive several challenges in the court system. So it kind of morphed into what we now refer to as extreme vetting. This is where you're generally given a form. It's called the DS 5535 at your interview. And the officer will ask for 15 years of work history and travel history, et cetera. And the process can take well beyond a year to conclude. It's a really nasty situation. And it continues to this day. We also saw things like Presidential Proclamation 10043. And although that only affected a handful, a few hundred Chinese students and researchers, it was still alarming because we saw not only visas being denied, but even visas that had been issued being subjected to revocation. And to make matters worse, the State Department has still not published any sort of definitive list of the institutions or, the other criteria that would give rise to these issues. And so this is kind of the lay of the land from a very high level from the last administration. And so I want to share a couple of numbers, but before I do, let me just caveat this. Let me preface this by saying I'm not sharing the next slide to scare anybody. I really am going to share this to illustrate how important the visa process is as we then transition to what we're seeing now in the new administration. So every year, the State Department publishes visa approval and denial rates. And so in 2023, we were seeing roughly 1 in every 3 student visa applicants facing a denial, a refusal at their visa interview. Now, last year in 2024, that jumped up to 41%. And this kind of angers me a little bit because I can't imagine that 41% of student applicants don't qualify for their visa. And so this really does tell me that too many students are going into their interview without knowing what to expect and without knowing how to prepare. And so I want to illustrate the importance of the interview here and the importance of proper preparation. And we're going to come back to that at the end of my presentation here. So let's shift to the current Trump administration. What has happened so far and what do we expect? And so you'll see a lot of uncertainty still. There have been well over 100 executive orders and memoranda and other statements from the White House that have brought about some pretty fundamental and wide sweeping changes to the federal government. But we have not yet seen any real concrete changes to visa processing. And so the one thing that I can say with certainty is that we should all expect more delays throughout the process. And this predominantly comes from, well, a few things, but it predominantly comes from hiring freezes and what is called reductions in force, where people are either being enticed to leave various government agencies or they might just be outright terminated or fired. And what that means is the workforce, including within the State Department, will shrink. And that also means that it will be more difficult and possibly impossible to hire new employees. And so all of the various operations throughout the visa process will take more time. It will take longer to schedule an interview with fewer people to facilitate that process. It will take longer to review waivers if you need a waiver. It will take longer to review documents if you're in administrative processing. And even if you are approved, it will take longer to print out the visa stamp, put it in the passport, and return the passport to you. Now, this is also due to the closure of several consulates. Now, the list of consulates that is closing or will be closing is right now fairly limited. And it's limited to very small consulates, which largely don't process visas anyway. But this could be a sign of more closures or maybe limitations of operations to come, which of course will then result in additional delays as well. Now, the State Department is not the only agency that is affected by these reductions in force. We are also expecting additional delays in other ways, which could affect how quickly you are authorized to work as a student, whether that's for CPT or OPT. So, one recommendation here is you should be very close with your international student team as early as possible before you even get to the United States. Be friends with your designated school official, your DSO, and their staff, their team, because they are the ones that will help you navigate through work authorizations and help you maintain your status. So if there's anything you can do earlier, that will generally help you avoid some delays and hopefully avoid having to push back, maybe work opportunities or other opportunities. We have also seen an executive order that specifically requires, and it's unfortunately very vague, but it specifically requires additional screening or vetting of visa applicants. Now, the way this executive order was drafted, the Secretary of State is required to submit a report within 60 days to the White House of certain countries that may lack some sort of security screening process. And so we don't yet know how this will actually affect visa applicants. But again, I do expect additional delays. This could manifest in more extreme vetting, more administrative processing. And so again, it's probably wise to navigate through this process as early as you can. Another thing that will cause more delays, and sorry, it's more bad news here. If you're familiar with what is commonly referred to as the Dropbox, this is a program where you can renew a visa if you meet certain criteria without having to schedule an interview. You basically file an application and, with just a few documents, your visa can be renewed. Those policies, the people or the requirements to qualify for this interview waiver program, as it's known, those requirements are being narrowed a little bit. This started at our consulates and embassy in India, and we're now seeing this expand to other posts. So first, review if you might qualify for a visa renewal without an interview. And note that with more people now being required to schedule interviews, there will of course be fewer interview slots available, which again means more delay just in the entire process, unfortunately. And then to make matters even worse and more complicated, The State Department used to publish up-to-date wait time figures for every embassy and consulate around the world. So you could plan ahead and say, okay, maybe it's a 400-day wait to schedule an interview in Mumbai. Maybe I should think about going to Chennai, for example. Well, those wait times are no longer available online. The figures have not been updated since January 7th, so it is unfortunately more difficult to plan ahead and figure out where you should be scheduling your interview. So, the gist of all of this, my recommendation, I want to be very clear, is to start whatever process you need to go through as early as possible. Whether that is applying for your first visa, applying for maybe a work authorization, renewing your visa, whatever it is, even looking at opportunities after you graduate. Everything will likely take much longer. So don't procrastinate and don't delay. So that's what I absolutely expect. I now want to shift a little bit to what could happen. And again, I don't want to scare anybody. There's a fine line here when I'm advising my clients between, giving good advice and telling people what's happening versus just scaring people. Because again, we don't yet know exactly how some of these policies will really shape up in practice. But I will tell you that there is or there was an attempt to freeze federal funding for various research. An example was projects funded by the National Institutes of Health. And so this was generally focused on health related research, which many master's degree students and PhD candidates were part of. Now, even though that order has been challenged and pretty much stopped in the court system, there's still lingering confusion over whether funding will or will not be available. And many universities have actually decided not to admit certain master's degree students. They've even canceled some of their PhD programs. So I know it's a very fluid situation, but it is important to try to stay up to date on developments as they come kind of rapid fire right now. We also may see more country specific vetting. I mentioned extreme vetting and Presidential Proclamation 10043. Again, we don't know which countries will be specifically targeted, if any, but I think it's probably safe to assume that there will be additional restrictions, and they may even rise to the level of an outright ban for all visas from a specific country. This is somewhat unprecedented, but we did see it in the last administration with the so-called Muslim ban. And we also saw it during this administration back in late January, albeit only for a few days, but there was an outright halt to all visa interviews in Colombia for a few days when Colombia refused to accept migrants or deportees into the country. So this is something that could happen as well. Now, something that I'm not quite as confident about, but I am hearing about it through various channels of immigration lawyers, university administrators, is the potential for restrictions on CPT and OPT opportunities, probably most specifically targeting the fields that qualify for STEM OPT extensions. There was an executive order that rescinded a previous executive order from President Biden, specifically trying to facilitate foreign nationals with AI expertise to get into the country. Now, with the rescinding or rescission, if that's a word, of that order, there's a kind of a telegraphed interest now in promoting AI expertise from within the United States. And so we may see more of that as part of this kind of so-called America First policy to limit certain work opportunities. And again, we haven't seen this really happen yet, but it's important to stay close with your school administrators and with organizations like Go Elite to make sure you know what might or might not be possible. And then finally, there is a strong possibility that some student visas for certain countries might be limited. For example, where you may have previously seen a 2 or even a 4-year student visa, that may be limited to now 1 year. which doesn't necessarily affect you until you leave the country. And so it's important to know that the length of time that your visa is valid for doesn't really affect you while you are in the country and actively studying and not violating any visa related requirements. If you are what's called in status or an active student status, then it doesn't matter if your visa expires. But remember that your visa is essentially a ticket back into the country if you leave. So if your visa expires and you decide to maybe travel for a holiday, or maybe there's an emergency and you have to go home to visit family, if your visa has expired, you can't get back into the country until you renew that visa. So the question is really, when is the right time? When is the safest time to renew a student visa? And so if we look at the general student visa journey, obviously you'll need to secure a student visa initially before you come to the United States and start class. While you are studying, you might engage in some work experience through CPT or pre-completion OPT. Then you graduate. Then you may continue some work experience through OPT and even STEM OPT. And so, my recommendation to students is that you plan ahead and you try, if it's possible, to renew your F1 visa before you graduate. And this is really for a simple reason, and that's that a student visa is designed for you to study in the United States. Although OPT and CPT are amazing opportunities, and obviously you're not breaking the law if you're authorized for these opportunities, it can be a little bit difficult kind of psychologically for a visa officer to decide to approve a student visa for a student who already graduated and especially a student who's now working. So it's just generally a safer option. It's a safer route to renew your student visa while you are still a student. In other words, before you graduate. But many universities are, and I think rightly so, advising students that if they don't need to leave the country, it's safer still to stay in the United States. As long as you are maintaining your student status, it's better to not face a potential denial of your renewal application, and it's also safer not to have to deal with the customs officials when you go back to the United States. So it's kind of a harsh thing to recommend, but if you don't need to leave the country, that right now is absolutely safest. So I want to, before I open it up for questions, I want to spend just a couple minutes on the visa interview itself. So I think most people here have already gone through the interview process once. Hopefully you've already successfully gotten your first student visa, but it's still worth reminding everybody that visa interviews are very short. When I was a visa officer, I would regularly interview well over 100 or even 150 people every single day. And that means that I had a minute up to maybe 3 minutes for each interview. And so don't be surprised when a visa officer is impatient. They may interrupt you during the interview. They may be, tapping their hand on the table. That's just unfortunately kind of a fact of how little time they actually have to do their job. Visa officers will generally start by looking at the answers you provide to your DS 160. They will look at a lot of information they have in their computer system, and then they will start asking you some questions. And now it's important to know that the way the law is written, it's your responsibility as a visa applicant to convince your visa officer that you are qualified or that you deserve a student visa. If you don't convince the officer that you are going to the US to study as a full-time student, that you can afford your educational program, and that you're going to return home after you graduate, the officer can deny you for basically any reason. Quite simply, they just weren't convinced. So during your interview, it's very important that you are honest and personal, that you are authentic, that you explain your situation at home, your motivation to study in the United States, and your plans after you graduate from a very personal perspective. It's also important that you're confident. And now everybody is nervous during the visa interview. I would actually think it was weird when I encountered an applicant who wasn't nervous because this is a major, major milestone in your life. But if you understand what to expect and you're properly prepared, then confidence will follow. You'll find that it's easier to explain everything and answer your visa officer's questions. And that is very important. And so we always advise students to be very proactive during the interview. Because remember, it's your responsibility to establish your qualifications for the visa. You shouldn't wait for the visa officer to ask you specific questions before you volunteer the following details. So first, you need to explain where you are planning to study or where you are currently studying and the degree that you're seeking. It's good to include the school you're attending and maybe where that school is located, especially if it's not a top tier university that everybody has heard of. Then it's important to volunteer why you chose this school and the particular major or degree that you are seeking. What was your motivation? And this is where it's very important to be personal, authentic. So instead of saying something that sounds kind of like a Google search result, something like, this school will help me find a good career. That doesn't really tell the visa officer anything. It's more important that you explain your personal motivation. What led you to your personal decision to study this topic at this school? And then don't stop there. Explain what you're planning to do after you graduate. How will this degree make a difference to your life, your career? And why is this degree so important for you? And then finally, how are you going to pay for everything? Visa officers are all keenly aware that, education is unfortunately very expensive in the United States. So they need to be confident that you have made arrangements to pay for your school and your living expenses. So be very detailed when you explain how you're going to pay for your education. So with that, just a couple of last minute reminders, and then I want to open this up to Q&A. First, it is very important. I've mentioned this a few times. It's important to try to stay as up to date as you possibly can on developments that are just rapidly unfolding right now. So I would urge all of you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We offer free videos virtually every week. And we also try to offer as many updates as we can. And of course, that's all free. Beyond that, we also offer a very comprehensive set of online self-service guides that help you through every step of the process. We have a course that is specifically focused on how to complete the DS-160, how to answer every question there with tips along the way. We have a course that's focused on how to prepare for the interview itself, including examples of good and bad interviews, and a proven method to effectively communicate with your visa officer. And then we have a complete guide, which covers the entire end-to-end journey, from the I-20 to your travel to the United States. And for the complete guide, you also get access to a bi-weekly live question and answer session with either myself or my partner, Mandy, so you can ask all of your kind of lingering visa-related questions. So visit us at zfvisaguides.com. And if you enter coupon code GOELITEF1, you'll get a 25% discount at checkout. That's pretty great. And then if you have specific complications, or you would like a kind of a more one-on-one approach to practice potential interview questions, then reach out to us at our law firm. You can go to zfvisa.com or just send us an email to info@zfvisa.com, and we can walk you through the process to schedule a consultation and explain a little bit more how we can help you with your unique situation. So Ryan, with that, I will turn it back over to you. Let's try to answer as many questions as we can.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Travis, for your wonderful presentation. I did myself did learn a lot about, what could be expected. Everything is unpredictable, but this is definitely some great insights from your side. And before we go ahead and jump right into the Q&A, I do want to remind everybody two things. The first thing is that we take the questions on the rolling basis. So the sooner you ask the questions, the better that it could be addressed. So if you do have a burning question you want to ask, make sure to send it in right now. The second part is that I took a look at the Q&A. We have plenty of great questions, and some of the questions might not be as relevant as the others when it comes to F1 visas or visa stamping or international travel. And we wanted to make this opportunity more valuable and exclusive to those in need. So if you do have questions regarding, for example, applications to green card, to H-1B, those are great questions, and we will definitely have those information sessions in the future that you can participate, but we might not address that because it's not relevant to today's topic. Okay, let me share my screen. And like I mentioned, if you do have questions you wanted to address or seek help with, feel free to send us an email or contact your advisor. We'll make sure to find you the right guidance. And I hope everybody could see that it's not too small, but I will read it out. The first question is it okay if the school on my F1 visa is different from the school on my current I-20? Can I still travel using the old school's F1 and new school's I-20?
This is a good question. I actually get this question all the time because the regulations are a little bit vague here. So it's arguably possible to travel to the United States on a previous yet still valid F1 as long as you have a valid and current I-20. The problem, though, is that once you get to the airport or the border crossing, the customs official that you talk to is much more likely to grill you with lots of questions. When did you start this new program? Where are you going to school? They'll be a little bit more skeptical. And so my advice is always to seek a new F1 visa if you are starting a new program, and especially if you're going to a new school, because then everything on the visa matches everything on the I-20 form, and you should have a much more streamlined entry to the country.
Absolutely. Um, Going on to next question, I think this is a very good question. Should we carry original I-20 with us every day because the immigration checks happening across the country? For example, if you're like these people wanted to know if I'm actually currently in the US with an F1 status, should I carry my I-20 with me?
This is another really good question. And before January 20th, I would have said no, there's no need. But I think it's actually a good idea to do that, although I don't recommend the original I-20. What some universities are doing, and I think this is a great idea, is they're recommending that students scan their I-20 and then kind of shrink it down so that it's easier maybe to fit in your wallet or your purse, and then you can carry that with you. I think it's a good idea. Hopefully, you'll never have to show it to anybody, but it would be safer.
Absolutely. Next one, I have an F1 visa interview coming up for a day one CPT school in a week. Should I bring up or should I talk about CPT in the interview?
So I mentioned earlier that it's easier to renew a visa if you're still actively studying as opposed to after you graduate. And this is kind of similar because remember your student visa is predominantly, designed so that you can be a student. CPT is great. I'm not saying that it's not a great option, but during your interview, I would recommend that you focus primarily on where you're going to school, what you are going to study, how you're going to pay for it, all those recommendations that I just covered. If the visa officer asks you if you're planning to, work and go through maybe a CPT program, you should absolutely talk about it. But otherwise, I would focus more intently on, your plans as a student.
Right, absolutely. Moving on from that questions, the four questions, I am traveling back to renew my F1 visa, which is similar to the last person asking. My country has an interview waiver request if the individual meets certain criteria, which I have been granted. My question is, how do I increase my renewal chance, the success rate, aside from submitting the required documents?
It's a good question, and unfortunately, there's not really a lot I can tell you to increase your chance of success. I think if you have time, you should definitely try to apply through this program because it's easier. But students are often called back in for an interview. Sometimes visa officers may have a question about what you're studying, what research you're doing. They may want to see an additional document. And so, if you're really kind of running short on time, I might actually suggest that you go ahead and just schedule an interview because if you go through the Dropbox and then you are called back in for an interview, now that could just add several more weeks of delay to kind of the entire process. And so it's hard to kind of say generally this is going to be more of kind of a one by one consideration, but feel free to reach out and we can look at that a little bit deeper.
Absolutely. Next question, I don't think is relevant to F1 visa specifically, is more about change of status in the United States. So if you do have that question, scan the QR code. Our consultants will make sure to find you the great connection for that.
I'll
What?
say quickly on that,
Yeah,
Ryan,
yeah.
that changing status, and this is weird because it's obviously legal. It's a process, managed by the U.S. government. It can lead to additional scrutiny when you go back for another visa interview. The whole idea here is that, if you obtained a tourist visa, in this case, a B2 visa, and you entered the country and then you changed to be a student, you really should have just applied for a student visa in the first place. And so visa officers will start questioning your motivations. And so if possible, my recommendation would be just to get a student visa before you start school, as opposed to changing status within the United States.
Sure. All right, moving on. How to prove tied to home country while my intent is actually to seek opportunity after graduation. This is a very good and honest question.
It is an honest question. And I think we all understand that, many people who study in the United States will desire to work in the United States after they graduate. My recommendation here is to think about, first of all, if the door was shut on any US opportunity, what would you be doing back at home? And beyond maybe your potential career back at home, think about all the other ties you might have, through family members, maybe social obligations, maybe you're thinking about getting married. There's a lot of ways that you can establish that you have, these ties to your home without lying and saying that you're definitely not planning to work in the United States.
Absolutely. Next question will be more focusing on the F1 OPT applications. So I don't know if you wanted to jump into that, but I don't think is that relevant to today's questions. Uh,
This is
um,
something I'm sure, Go Elite might be able to offer some guidance, but I would also say that you should talk to your school administrators
Absolutely.
because they will also be able to help guide you through these processes as well.
Absolutely. All right, let's take a look at the next question. Um, what are your expectations? I don't know if this is relevant. This is talking about the notice to appeal for situations when change of status is denied. I think it's also mentioning about change of status in the US.
Mhm. I think that this is going to be a case by case situation. This is generally part of a larger trend towards kind of coming down hard on status violations and immigration violations. I don't think it's necessarily a good sign for foreign nationals, but this is where I think you really should consult a qualified immigration attorney and evaluate your options.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's move on to the next one. I think it is a great question. Are there any reasons that someone can get denied at the port of entry in the United States? And while they still have a valid visa, valid I-20, or other immigration documents in hand? If so, what would be your tips to potentially avoid and handle this?
First of all, yes, there is certainly always a potential to be denied entry to the United States, even if you've done everything correct. The Customs and Border Protection or CBP officials who you will be interacting with have a pretty wide range of power to control our nation's borders. Now, they're going to be potentially asking you all sorts of questions. And so I would treat that interaction just like you treat a visa interview. But note that they have the ability to search through your phone. They may look at social media accounts. They may ask you all sorts of what seem like very bizarre questions about, maybe whether you have or might be working without authorization, for example. And so there are many reasons why you may encounter problems. I think generally speaking, my advice to you would be try to do everything in your power to not violate any visa regulations. Don't work without authorization, maintain a full course load, make sure you're generally passing classes, stay very close with your DSO and their team at school, and again, be prepared to provide some details and answer some questions when you enter the country. Hopefully, I'm crossing my fingers you won't have any issues.
Absolutely. I think you made a very great point, Travis. We heard from some of the students that when they are making their interest back to the United States, their phone are actually checked, and they mainly checking on from the incidents that I have heard, they're mainly checking on if they have illegal work in the US, if they are working without actually a work permit like OPT or CPT. So I think this is definitely an important issue, and we do advise students to not work without the permission. I think this is very important. Moving on to the next questions. Is it recommended to live and work at the same location? I think this is more related to in the United States while on F1 visa. But this person just wanted to know in general, is it more recommended to live and work at the same location as they choose the school? Would that make the F1 journey a little bit safer?
I think it would, but I'm not sure it's absolutely necessary. This goes back to what I was saying earlier that a student visa is predominantly designed for you to be a student. And so if you're in a situation where you're working, 3 states over from where you're going to school, it might be a little bit more difficult for an officer to conclude that your real intent is to be a student and you're not just trying to use this visa to get a job.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move on to the next question. I think this one talks about H1B sponsorship, so that might not be that relevant. The next one, you mentioned that the F1 visa when planning to come to the US from home country. In my case, I'm from Peru and I'm in the United States, and I changed my status to the students right here. I'm currently studying English because I plan to pursue a master's degree. Does anything you mentioned apply to my situation? I think it does, because if you did change from another visa type to F1 visa, you did went through a change of status. And then the person also wanted to know that uh, if he or she wanted to traveling back to their countries and return to the US, what would you recommend me to do specifically if they wanted to? Oh, I think I'm reading the Mexico question. So sorry if
Well,
I'm
I mean, I'll
confusing you.
answer this kind of quickly. Yes,
Yeah,
everything does apply. I think it will be a little bit more complicated if you leave the country and you need to apply for a new visa. There will be some questions about, why didn't you get a student visa already? But beyond that, when you go to a different school, you will need to transfer your SEVIS registration. And so both your current school and your new school will be involved in that process. And so you should work with both of them to coordinate that and make sure that you are maintaining your student status so that you don't have any other complications down the line.
absolutely. Next one, I just get accepted to Georgetown University for master's. Congratulations, first of all. And I would like to go back to Mexico to stamp my passport, but I feel kind of insecure because I previously had studied ESL for 2 years. I could continue with my legal status, which is F1, I think, but I would like to feel more secure when traveling and return to the US. Would you recommend me to go to Mexico to stamp my F1, or what are your thoughts on this situation?
So to give you a definite answer, I would need to, know much more about your situation and evaluate the risks that you might face. But I think generally, yes, it's safer not to leave the country. But this is where I don't feel like that always is really a viable option. What if, and I'm just gonna, throw an example out there. What if your grandmother is gravely ill and in the hospital? If you don't have a valid visa and you have to go back, and let's say it's a Thursday that you have to go back home to see your grandmother, and you want to be back at school for Monday's class, well, if you have to get a new visa, you're not going to make it back by Monday, and it may be another several weeks before you get back to the United States. So, I like to say it's better to have a valid student visa, but again, we would need to talk much more in detail to evaluate, some specific risks that you might face.
Absolutely. All right, moving on to the next questions. I think we touched on this before in terms of renewing F1 versus applying for a new F1. And then let's phrase this question this way. So what would be the different perspectives for somebody to go to stamping to renew their F1 versus somebody to get a new F1 visa?
Well, I think, it's going to take longer. I think especially if you don't qualify for the Dropbox program, it's just going to take longer to schedule the interview and for everything else to happen. Now, depending on what country you're from, what you're studying, maybe what research you're doing, there could be additional challenges as well. There could be more administrative processing. There could be extreme vetting. There could be, kind of a new version of Presidential Proclamation 10043. So I think generally, yes, this is going to be more difficult. Uh, but I think you should probably talk to an immigration lawyer to evaluate your unique situation to give you a more definitive answer.
Right, absolutely. And then also, as Travis mentioned, something very important is that a lot of things we don't know yet. So we
Mhm.
cannot give you definitive answers of, yes, this is going to be challenging because of X1Z. A lot of it is just, based on what we have heard and based on some of our thoughts and opinions. So I wouldn't say if there is like a definitive answer, but we do recommend you to talk to someone professional in terms of these kind of things. All right, moving on. Will a third country visa renewal be accepted or not? I think you can go to a third country to renew your F1 visa. And then this person is from a Indian background, wanting to get F1 stamping from Mexico or Canada, and wondering will that work?
So generally, yes, it's acceptable. I think as a first step, you should look at the website for the consulate or the embassy where you're planning to renew your visa, just to make sure they accept what are called third country nationals. People that are not from the U.S. or that country. The other thing that I would just say as a word of caution is understanding that there will be more delays throughout this process. You should also double check that wherever you go, Mexico, Canada, or elsewhere, that you will be able to stay there for potentially several weeks. There may be visa restrictions that you might be under. It may just be difficult to be in a place where maybe you don't speak the language. And so take that into account. I would not plan for a very quick turnaround. For example, if I went to Mexico to renew my visa right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just to add a little bit to that point, I think in one of our previous sessions, Travis, you mentioned something pretty important to me that if the applicant haven't returned to their home country after a while, is more recommended to actually go back to the home country to renew their F1 or other visas, because the visa officers might have questions why are they not returning after a several long period of time.
Yes, that's a fantastic point because remember, one of the key considerations is are you going back home after you graduate? And so now, if you're not back home, yes, you haven't graduated yet, but it does raise a question of, is there a reason you're not going back home? And then the other consideration is visa officers are they get very accustomed to interacting with local nationals of the country where they're working. So as an example, when I worked in Mexico, Mexico is a great example. I was extremely accustomed to interacting with Mexican citizens who speak Spanish, who have Mexican passports. And then if I saw an applicant from, let's say, China or India, it was strange, and it would sometimes kind of catch me by surprise a little bit, and I would wonder, what are you doing here in Mexico? And so it can potentially add just a little bit more scrutiny, maybe some additional questions to the interview. And so yes, it's safer to go back to your home country.
Absolutely. Next question, is it safe to travel during stand OPT when you have all the valid documents? And I would have around 25 days left, not too much left on stand OPT. Could I still enter back to the United States? I think this is also a great question. A lot of people are questioning about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a tough one. It's certainly safer not to leave the country. Because every time you come back to the country, there's a potential for the CBP officer to, first hassle you with a lot of questions, and then maybe not let you into the country. I think if you're doing everything correctly, you have all the valid documents, you can show that you're authorized for this experience, uh, you should be okay. But anecdotally, we're starting to hear just within the immigration law community that more, particularly Indian students who are on OPT, have been subjected to additional questions when they re-enter the country. Again, that's just anecdotal stuff. It's not really, this isn't necessarily something that is happening to everybody, but it's always a bit of a risk when you leave the country to come back,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
absolutely. And I think for this person, if you have to go back, since that short amount of time
Mhm.
that you have remained on your stand OPT, you gotta have like a very emergency reason to go back and then come back to the United States. So I think for this kind of particular situation, it's better to connect with Travis for more in-depth guidance on what kind of things that you can do, because right now we still lack a conversation of your intentions, whether or not that could be accepted.
Agreed.
Moving on, I think this is our last questions. I'm not sure if you guys still have additional questions. If you do, definitely drop that into the Q&A. Last question would be, what are the chances of F1 visa reinstatement currently? I don't know if you're familiar with the process. Basically, somebody lost their F1 visa and they're trying to prove that it's not their fault. I applied for the reinstatement in this month.
This is a very case by case, question. It's going to completely depend upon what led to, the issue in the past. Why are you seeking reinstatement? How can you explain everything? So this is absolutely a place where I would recommend that you talk to a qualified expert, preferably an immigration attorney. And you should probably also talk to your school as well. They may be able to give you some initial guidance.
Mhm. I think we still have a little bit of questions coming in, so just gonna read it off the chat, off what people are asking right now. I see one question: if someone who doesn't go to their home country, um, that gets sorry, I'm not sure if this person is asking something relevant, but visa expired, but their status is maintained. Oh, this person wanted to know that if the F1 visa is expired, but if I don't go back after the visa is expired, would that be a challenge or a problem because I don't have an F1 visa?
Well, so if I understand this correctly, so you're leaving the country and your visa expired. Yeah, I mean the issue is that you'll need a new visa. So remember the visa is your ticket into the country. And so you may be completely, in status, progressing through your studies, not violating any restrictions, but without that valid F1 visa, you can't get back into the country.
Absolutely. And I also see another questions asking that do we need a job before day one CPT or apply to day one CPT while we're out of the US? I think I can give an answer to that. The answer is uh, it would depend on the program whether or not curricular practical training is required. And then the second part of the question is yes, you can apply for a master's degree while you're in India. And I think we do have new questions. Okay, we just pasted that questions and we still have plenty of new questions coming in. We're just gonna give probably a minute for our coordinator to paste the questions. Meanwhile, next questions. I am enrolled in Day One CPT program and as a transfer student. So my F1 is expires and I'm out of work. I'm planning to take a semester break during the summer. But during the semester break, could I travel back and then come back? Or is it more recommended for me to stay put here in the United States? So they are currently enrolled students, F1, but they're currently going through a semester break. So how will international travel work in that kind of scenario?
So this is a pretty nuanced situation, and I would say first talk to your school. You know there's various ways that you can take what's called a leave of absence. There might be other options, but if you are taking an entire semester break, you are probably not going to be in status, and so you may actually have to leave the country. And then at that point, you know, it depends on if your visa is still valid or not. You may also have other complications when you get back to the border. So I think the first thing I would recommend is talk to your school, evaluate the options that might be available to you to take some time off, and then talk to an immigration lawyer to understand how that might affect your visa.
Right, absolutely. One important note is that, whenever as an international student, when you decided to travel, there is a mandatory process of requesting an international travel signature, which is your international department should, you know, give approval to your travel before you go. So definitely, as Travis mentioned, is definitely recommended to talk to your international department or DSO before you actually book the ticket and leave the United States. I'm seeing another questions that I think is very, very good. This person is thinking about taking a second master. So if he or she does choose to take a second master, is there any risk when I go back to my home country and apply for F1 visa again?
Fantastic question. And so I think about this in terms of, you know, what is a common student situation versus maybe what is a more non-traditional student situation. And I'm not saying that you're doing anything wrong, but that's kind of how a visa officer will think about this. So kind of a more traditional student situation is you graduate from high school or secondary school, you go into a university program, then you go to a master's degree program, and then maybe you go to a PhD program. A non-traditional approach might be you have got several years of a gap, maybe between high school and university, or university and a master's program. Or maybe you're seeking a second degree at the same level, like a second master's degree program. And so remember, the first question the visa officer is going to be asking themselves is, are you a student? You know, do you present as somebody who's going to the United States to be a full-time student who's eventually going to graduate? Or are you using the student visa again as that ticket into the country to do something else, like maybe find a job, for example? And so if you're not in that more kind of quote unquote traditional bucket, it's just more important that you explain your motivation behind seeking a second degree at the same level. You know, why did you reach this decision? What will this mean for your career? And this is where I would recommend that you review our online guides because we specifically talk about some of these less traditional routes and how you can effectively explain that situation during your interview and hopefully avoid any complications.
Absolutely. Great point. And for timing purposes, I think we will answer one last question. We do see a lot of new questions rolling in. Unfortunately, we couldn't answer each and everybody's questions, but if you do have any questions related to Day One CPT or like H-1B visa, feel free to scan the QR code. Our consultants could answer your questions if they're capable of. If they couldn't answer your questions, we can refer you to Travis, immigration attorneys like Travis himself, who are experts in their field and help resolve your questions. Okay. Well, last question is this person wanted to know specifically about automatic visa revalidation provisions that allow students whose F1 has expired to briefly visit Canada and Mexico and return back to the United States. So the person just wanted to know more about should he or she still use this if this is something that a lot of people do, and then should I stay with my I-20 or travel with this visa revalidation? Or should I actually renew my visa and go through the whole visa renewal process?
It's hard to give you an answer without knowing more about your situation, unfortunately. This is an area where you really kind of want to evaluate risks and potential benefits so that you can make the best decision. But I would be questioning, what are you studying? What are your plans? How much longer are you going to be studying? What's happened in your past? So this is where I would recommend that you talk to an immigration lawyer to evaluate basically the pros and cons of your options.
Absolutely. All right. I think that's it for everyone. Thank you so much, Travis, for bringing us wonderful presentations and addressing a lot of questions from our audiences today. And as I mentioned, if we couldn't get to your questions, don't worry, scan the QR code. We can either answer the question for you or connect you with Travis. And hopefully we will see each other once again. Thank you so much, Travis.
Thank you, Ryan. It was an honor to be here. Good luck to all of you in your visa journeys.
Thanks. Thank you, Travis. Thank you, everyone, for coming in, and wish everybody have a great night. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.